The great thing about the COVID vaccines is that experts seem to be telling us that they are safe, but then they also tell us that they aren't safe. Some of the experts tell us that vaccines must be distributed according to race-based priority lists. Have you heard about that? And then there are all the public policy experts at America's largest corporations who tell us what our political opinions should be on all the hottest topics of the day. So we're going to talk about these know-it-alls and a lot more on today's edition of the Independent Outlook. Greetings, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We're across the bay from San Francisco, and we try to bring you an independent perspective on the news and events of the day. I am joined, as is often the case, by my colleague, Dr. Williamson Evers, who is the director of the Independent Institute's Center on Educational Excellence. Welcome to Dr. Bill Evers.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you. And boy, do you have a nice looking bookcase behind you today.
Thank you. It's very full.
Yeah, you've read every single book. Okay. I'm going to turn
Some
also
of them
then,
are reference books, and I haven't read them through.
Okay. Have a realistic expectation there. Also joined today on an occasional basis, as we often do, with William Watkins. We're delighted to have you with us. Bill Watkins is a research fellow here at the Independent Institute. He is obviously an attorney. If you know his background, he's written a lot of books on legal history and legal philosophy. An earlier book called Judicial Monarchs, which is on my reading list. Mr. Watkins, I want to read that, Case for Restoring Popular Sovereignty in the United States. Also, some books with us, including this great one here, Crossroads for Liberty, very much worth reading by William J. Watkins. And you also may be aware, those of you who followed his work, that he publishes frequently, both professionally and more popularly. On the popular side, you might see him sometimes in Forbes, USA Today, San Francisco Examiner, Washington Times, and so forth. Welcome, Bill Watkins.
Good to see you as always, Graham.
It really is a pleasure to have you. Thank you for taking the time to join us from all the way across the country. But of course, we do have people with us on this broadcast from a lot of places. We have people following us on our YouTube channel, on our Facebook page, on our Twitter feed, and most importantly, through thinkspot.com. We have a lot of friends around North America, really, and maybe beyond, who follow this program on ThinkSpot, and we're so grateful to our partnership with ThinkSpot and our friends there. So call out to ThinkSpot. There's a lot to talk about today. I mean, we could go a lot of places with the news of the day today. Let me just begin with a couple of observations that maybe Bill Evers may have some initial reactions to. A lot of us are aware of the fact that now the vaccination process is getting going. Something like 25% of Americans have been vaccinated with at least one shot. That's a lot of people. So that's encouraging. And at the same time, now suddenly this Johnson & Johnson vaccine is suddenly being put on pause because there are at least 6 young women who have developed blood clotting as a result of taking the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or so it seems, but maybe not. So CDC has recommended putting a pause on Johnson & Johnson. What should we think about CDC and Dr. Fauci recommendations regarding pausing Johnson & Johnson vaccinations? Any thoughts on that, Evers?
Yes. Well, the first thing is to understand that this is really a mandatory shutdown, even though they're talking about it as advice, because they're stopping the shipment. Okay, so
I saw the word recommendation, so I got confused.
You can see. Yeah, well, you know how government is. It's all euphemism. So, and of course, people with scheduled vaccinations for the Johnson & Johnson they're all being canceled everywhere.
I have a friend who got canceled.
Right. So there's, as people in legal theory say, there's over-inclusiveness. So even if you want to take, I think, too seriously the few problem cases, health cases, it should be confined to women of childbearing age. That seems to be the age that we're talking about here in terms of possible danger, and look into that. But there's no reason to suspend it for the other people. There have been no problems for anybody else. And the real problem is these are decision makers who seem to not be able to do cost-benefit analysis. Millions and millions of people have had this shot, and there's a few people who've had a problem that may stem from this shot. And, this is a new way of making shots, vaccines for this sort of antiviral thing. And so, we can't expect, other shots have problems too. It's not like everything is perfect in a medical realm.
Right.
So I just think the main thing to see is that these government leaders that are suspending this, that are stopping it, and they may cause both this one and AstraZeneca to never be able to recover, because of course this feeds vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaxxer ideology and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, they're causing deaths. I mean, this is such a rare phenomenon to have this problem with clots and so forth, that they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And they're saying, all these people who, people are still dying of this disease, and they're not going to be able to prevent that with the vaccine if the vaccine is suspended. It's not like we have too much of all different vaccines. I mean, Pfizer has said they're going to expand their production 10%, but that's not enough to take care of this. So what we have is politicians wanting to get their hands on it, risk-averse people. People have gotten much more risk-averse during this pandemic, and it's counterproductive.
Well, they're averse to risk. We're all averse to risk. What's difficult is that there are a whole set of different risks.
Yeah.
And our experts who are expert on one sort of risk don't seem to be aware of and really can't be well versed in the other sorts of risks that are less obvious.
But still, they're making decisions for millions of people, and they're denying them medical relief that could save their lives. I mean, in essence, this will kill people, what they're doing.
I mean, they did have to let people know that there were problems with,
Fine, that's fine.
But I think it sounds like what you're saying, Bill Evers, is that there should have been a focused and tailored response to the evidence as it emerged.
I don't even think that they should have paused it for anybody. They should have told people about it.
Yeah, people have to be informed.
And if I were a woman of childbearing age, I wouldn't take this shot. Now the problem when you go to these sites is you're sort of stuck with what they have. But I think they can figure out a way to address it for these women so they get something that's not causing the problem.
There are, of course, a lot of things to understand with respect to the risks of COVID and the vaccines. It's kind of a swirl of information for ordinary people, that's for sure. Yes. I mean, I noticed that the director of the CDC, Dr. Walensky, was referring to the situation now mounting in Michigan, where there's really quite a surge of cases there. And she says the answer, this is part of a transcript, where she says the answer is not necessarily to give vaccine. In fact, we know the vaccine will have a delayed response, she said. Well, that's because it takes a few weeks for you to get immune. So she says, hear the rest of this though. She says, the answer is that the answer to that is to really close things down, to go back to our basics, where we were last spring, last summer, and to shut things down. So it seems that now poor Michigan has to be, if they followed Dr. Walensky's advice, would be totally shut down again.
I can't, again, this is somebody, a health official making political decisions, and I think clearly they should surge vaccines into Michigan. The lockdowns have not worked. Again, by cost-benefit analysis, they are just overwhelmingly counterproductive.
I really hope that people in Michigan will realize that
they should be careful. Everybody in Michigan should be careful right now, though.
Yeah, you should be careful.
I grant that.
And you should be vaccinated. At the same time, it's really perplexing how these authorities can look at one piece of the equation, not the other. For example, the health fallout from closure and school closure to children and others is already being well documented now. Not just their learning deficits, but even their health outcomes. So sometimes we're doing a trade-off between one aspect of public health versus another delayed aspect of public health. Caution.
Well, we know the academic results for the children are horrible. I mean, you can look over the years into the future about how many. So a deep study has been done of Los Angeles, and some Stanford researchers did it, and they project that huge numbers of kids are never going to graduate. Clearly, math and English they're falling way behind. Elementary is falling even farther behind. These schools should have been kept open. Countries in Europe never closed their schools. They took precautions about distancing and face mask wearing and so forth. But there's been no real problem with children getting the disease or transmitting the disease. The teachers get it, but they get it from the other adults they mingle with. So we knew from very early on that it's old people that are in danger of getting serious things from this, not young people.
Right. Well, the thing is, clearly everybody should take really sensible, obvious precautions.
Right.
Get on with their life and get vaccinated.
They should get vaccinated. Another thing is the teachers' unions have taken advantage of this. They hold the children hostage. And, again, Los Angeles is a prime example of this. They're not really, they're giving parents a choice, if you call it a choice. Either keep your kids at home and learn online, or send your kids to school part-time, and the teacher's not even going to be in the room with the kids. The teacher is going to be virtually appearing on a screen in front of the kids in the school. It's ludicrous. They should be in school for in-person learning.
Okay, so here's a difficulty that Bill Watkins can help us think about, which is the fact that in some states, notably most recently Vermont, it may not be as easy as it should be to get vaccinated because you have to be in the right categories. I'm looking at this piece that we just published that you wrote, I guess, earlier today. We published your piece, Bill Watkins, on Vermont. It says Vermont unconstitutionally distributes COVID vaccine based on race. So you're telling us in this thing some facts that I was stunned by, Bill Watkins. So if you're a Vermonter and you're over 40, you can get the vaccine.
And you're white.
Well, yeah. If you're of any race over 40, you can get vaccine. Right. But if you're under 40, you can only get the vaccine if you belong to the proper racial category. People who are African American ancestry, indigenous, and other people of color.
So indigenous meaning American Indian.
I guess that's what that means. Bill Watkins, can you explain the Vermont policy and what's going on with it?
No, it's a travesty, the Vermont policy. We are rationing health care based on race, and that is unconstitutional. Essentially, if you are in a specific category, Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, anyone can get it. A 16-year-old can get the vaccine, a 60-year-old, a 30-year-old. It's wide open. However, if you are white and you are below 40, you're not entitled to get it, though someone similarly situated. And I use the example of a 39-year-old white breadwinner, 4 children, working for his family, afraid that he will get sick. He's not eligible to get it, but you just change one factor, make him a Black breadwinner, 4 children, afraid he's going to get COVID. He can get his shot today. They are rationing health care based on race. And, to do this under the Constitution, you would have to show a compelling state interest, but more importantly, that the categories you're using, this is narrowly tailored to further the state's interest. Problem is, go ahead, Brian.
Has this been contested yet in a court?
No, this is a fairly recent policy, but there's no way it would stand. And unfortunately, it's a Republican governor that is pushing this policy based on anti-racism and wokeness, that this is somehow pursuing equity, even though there's no scientific evidence that the color of your skin matters a lick, whether you're going to get COVID or have a bad result.
What if you're in Vermont and you're 39 years old and a breadwinner, and one of your parents is of European ancestry and one is of African ancestry. How do they handle that in Vermont? Do you know?
That's a good question. It's unfortunate we're to this point where, how do you measure?
It sounds like we're in
racial
South
purity?
Africa trying to decide all these weird racial categories in life or death matters. By the way, Bill Watkins, didn't we have early on in the COVID a Oregon situation where benefits were going to businesses that had suffered from the lockdown? And so the government was going to give benefits, but give them to these businesses, aid to these businesses, but give it on a basis of race. In other words, if you were otherwise similarly situated white business person, you would not get this benefit, but if you were an African American business owner, you would get it.
No, that's right. I mean, this is just even more pernicious. It's not just benefits.
So it's not just Republican governors. It's also Oregon, certainly one of the most liberal and Democratic Party governed states in the country.
What's shocking is that any governor could just think that this is legally permissible.
Right. What are they thinking? What are they thinking? I mean, all I can imagine is trying to put on my constitutional hat. Could it be that people in Vermont are thinking that somehow, since the 14th Amendment guarantees to everyone the equal protection of the laws, and since the COVID...
Don't try and make sense of it. This is just a neo-racist fashion.
What I'm trying to get at is that, the equity thing, it has a certain basis of plausibility that you said in your article that hospitalization rates were four times higher among non-Hispanic, among blacks than among non-Hispanic white people.
But I think most scientists think that this has to do with other factors. So higher levels of obesity, other health conditions, diabetes.
So the equal protection of the laws is probably the portion of the 14th Amendment which would be used to contest this because people are being treated differently by race.
Right.
But the people in Vermont might say, oh, well, we want people to be treated equally because the 14th Amendment guarantees equal hospitalization rates among different racial groups. Could that be their thinking?
It possibly could be, but as Dr. Evers mentioned, they already factor in for pre-existing conditions, such as if you have risk factors, you already can get the vaccine no matter what your age is. So that's already accounted for. If a minority group, for example, has a higher incidence of diabetes or obesity, as those are serious risk factors with COVID, you can already get the vaccine. This is just an unabashed racist policy in line with anti-racism today, which means you have to see things racially. It makes no good sense, but it's the fad of the day. And I mean, there's no basis in law to do this. You can't twist this. You couldn't get, Breyer and Sotomayor and Kagan and Roberts. We might as well throw him in there with them to sign off on this. This is beyond the pale. This is a 9 to nothing.
I just can't imagine it. That's passing muster with even the liberal wing of the Supreme Court. So I guess this is why you're calling it in your article a racial spoils system.
No, that's right. And this, what are we teaching people? That we're not one country, one people, but we're different ethnic groups are just fighting for resources and government benefits. And the name of the game is to get your people and your allies in power, and you reward them with health care or whatever else. What a message that is. It's pernicious.
It's one other aspect of this in terms of thinking about this as a spoil system and political maneuvering and so forth, the idea of vaccine passports. So, this has several facets to it. I mean, it's hard to say to a store owner or somebody like that, you can't ask people for proof that they've been vaccinated. I think they could do this. But when you talk about governments pushing this, or government mandated or government issued vaccine passports, this is really a tool to coerce people into getting vaccinated who might not want to. I think, I think we would all encourage people to get vaccinated, but some people are going to hold out, and it's part of freedom. But they might not be able to go to the gym or something for a while. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, so they're trying to coerce it. It encourages this scramble for vaccine privileges. So you get the teachers' unions and the government employees' unions, and you get various racial groups, and everybody's trying to push to the front of the line in order to get their vaccine passport. So the incentive structure in the vaccine passport is perverse, and it also leads to people who don't really need to get vaccinated right away because they're young and healthy. They are going to want to push their way into the front, whereas an elderly person that has various problems might get pushed aside by this scramble that's induced by the vaccine. So there's kind of a liberty issue. There's a liberty also for store owners, but there's this bad incentives for cronyism and corruption and spoil systems of a variety of sorts, but including racial spoils.
Your comment is interesting, Bill, about the incentive structure. And I think I've seen our research fellow, Phil Magnus, also make this.
Magnus has made this point very eloquently.
Interesting point. I mean, so that the young and healthy would scramble and get ahead of the line of those who are more vulnerable, less able to scramble, because they'll get rewarded with this passport.
Right.
So that's one level of the issue. But then, Bill Watkins, maybe you can address the legal angle a little bit better here than either of us can. Surely there's something problematic about at least government-issued vaccine passports. Is there anything in our constitutional structure or principles which would stand in the way of government-issued vaccine passports?
Sure. For a long time, it's been recognized that a privilege and immunity of citizens of the United States is the right to travel. Mm-hmm. I can see this vaccine passport issue impinging that right of people being able to go state to state, leave the country, this, that, and the other, go to certain businesses in interstate commerce.
But it's also affected by that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Massachusetts case having to do with smallpox vaccinations and school children. So you're right, obviously, about the right to travel has been recognized by the courts, even though we have things like Cuba travel and stuff that seem to be, they seem to ignore it sometimes. But point is, the government tries to use public health to expand its power, and we just have to be vigilant, as with other things.
One of our participants who's following with us today just tossed in a comment here, noting that vaccine passports look eerily similar to the Chinese social credit system. What do you think about that, Bill Watkins?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. If you look at this idea of appeasing the masters and doing what they wish to, get your credit on the right side of the scale, so you'll have more privileges than your other citizens, be treated better, be able to get more things, if you will, do more things. It's absolutely the same thing, a perfect analogy.
Apparently, somewhere down in Southern California, maybe in Orange County, I saw this article about how Orange County is going to now have a test run for its own county-based COVID vaccine passport system. Orange County, Bill, is that right, Bill?
Yes.
Bill Evers?
Yes, I am a legal resident of Orange County, and I did see this article in the Orange County Register, once a great newspaper. It's still pretty good editorial.
I was going to say,
page.
It's still pretty good comparatively.
It's still pretty good compared to others, but it's still not. It's not the old Hoyle's paper of yesteryear. Anyway, yes, the Orange County Public Health Agency is experimenting with this. So the idea, of course, is that you have your smartphone I have a flip phone, so I can't show mine. But you have a thing, and you would be able to go to some monitor, like when you go to the airport and have your boarding pass and match to them. So you do that, and then and so they have, Orange County has a vendor who does their scheduling for the shots, Athena, and they are going to try and do an experiment with this as a government vaccine passport.
You know, a lot of foreign countries have already, as
Right.
China, but also European countries, prior to this pandemic, have been issued national identification cards, which enable you to move around the country. I think that was the case in the Soviet Union too, that you couldn't move about without
Obviously,
having
the pass laws of South Africa. Is
the
another
past laws
classic.
of South Africa and so forth. Bill Watkins, what is it in the U.S. Constitution? I hope there's something real clear that makes it hard for a government, bodies of government in the United States to do that kind of, mass permission approval system. Is it the Fourth Amendment, privacy? Where do I don't see a right to travel, obviously, in the text of the Constitution. Where is this anchored legally? Obstruction to that.
No, that's a very good point. Here we have, your papers, please, something that sounds better out of a sort of a Cold War thriller with passengers going from West Germany through the Berlin corridor into the East, or, Warsaw Pact countries there, that it seems incongruent with freedom, and we've looked at it that way. However, here we are beginning to embrace these sorts of ideas. Again, Bushrod Washington, very early in his legal career as a judge in the early 1800s, recognized our privilege and immunity to travel freely to and from the seat of government and so forth. While there have been reasonable restrictions placed on that, it's sort of part of the American common law constitutional tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm a textualist. I might not have found that like
I was thinking of that as you spoke.
Did.
The judges have found it.
But I mean, it's established. I might disagree with it, but it's been established since 1818 at least. So that is in our constitutional framework.
Is that from maybe the 5th and 14th Amendment, which say that neither the national government nor the state government can deprive citizens of their liberty without due process of law?
Actually, he would trace it even further to the First Amendment. You're right, to assemble, to associate,
to assemble,
and
right.
therefore be able to travel in commerce. The idea of commerce, again, was not just economic activity, but it was traffic, that you could go back and forth among the states without any restrictions upon you.
What's really interesting about this conversation is if we have friends in Orange County listening to this, and if we have friends in Vermont listening to this, all you've got to do is go to independent.org, read the latest piece by William Watkins on the law in Vermont, and listen to some of the things we're suggesting. Now, these are all ripe for being legally contested, even though they haven't been contested yet.
And what these folks try to do is, I think, Vermont's policy is they keep moving the goalposts. They'll have a policy in place for so long, and then they will change it, which tries to affect standing to sue and mootness. Say, well, we had this policy. You were a 39-year-old plaintiff, but now we say everyone 30 and above can get it except white people under 20. You're 35. The case is moot as to you. So it's a legal game there as well.
Right. Well, there are some
to escape legal responsibility.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just take you on this passport thing in a slightly different angle, which is more subtle, and I don't know how to think about it. Maybe the two of you do better than I do. Put it this way, we've mentioned a right to travel, and in the legal context, a right to travel means that government cannot restrict you from traveling. That's what, a lot of these, the right to free speech means government can't restrict your speech. It doesn't mean your grandma can't tell you to shut up. It means that the government can't restrict your speech. So that's what we mean by right to travel normally. What about the issuance of vaccine passports by non-governmental entities? They wouldn't be enforceable by law or by the police, but there might be all sorts of ways in which different, private organizations or medical bodies or others could issue a vaccine passport, and different companies or airlines could say that they'll accept so-and-so's vaccine certification,
Right.
to let
So,
you get
so
on.
let's say let's say you were a gymnasium where people are working out and breathing heavily, and they might be somewhat close to each other, and it might. I mean, I think you should be able to do this, but I don't want to encourage it as a social practice or thing. One of the other things is it will encourage the continuation of lockdowns. We're starting to get out of lockdowns, and we're starting to get out of being a closed down society. If you start saying, oh, well, we're going to get these passports, then people will keep the lockdown on for everybody who doesn't have the passport.
Well,
So,
here's the thing I'm getting at. Let me interrupt you briefly.
Sorry,
Bill Evers.
I interrupted you. I apologize.
Well, looking at Florida, for example, so Governor
Okay.
DeSantis, I mean, I was kind of heartened when Governor DeSantis issued this order on the second day of this month of April, which forbids not only the state of Florida, but also private businesses from requiring proof of vaccination for admittance. So my first reaction was, yeah. But then I thought to myself, should the state of Florida really have the power to prevent a private business from making a private decision about who's allowed to enter their private premises? Bill Watkins, you're a lawyer. Help me out here.
Here's where you're going to run into a lot of state public accommodation and anti-discrimination provisions, and it's going to differ state to state. For example, just quickly, we've seen, recently Supreme Court cases dealing with, forcing a baker to bake a particular cake for homosexual wedding, this, that, and the other. State accommodation laws come into effect. What a lot of people forget is, for example, if that baker, say, refused to bake a cake for a Klansman, they wanted to have a Klan rally and they wanted KKK written on the cake, the baker could tell them to go fly a kite because being in the Klan or being white or whatever is not a protected category. However, in many state laws, sexual orientation or sexual preference, whatever you want to call it, is. And therefore it is protected. So while you could refuse one, you can't refuse the other. And some of these states have such broad classifications of who is protected and who's not. I mean, this could be a healthcare disability if you have chosen not to get the vaccine under some of the broadly worded statutes and would be prohibited. I mean, it's frankly a mess. And a lot of people just don't realize the mess that these state public accommodation laws have created. Rather than let businesses, make their own decisions, we have singled out certain groups for protection, and who knows really how broad some of this is until it's litigated. But it's a dangerous matter, these state public accommodation laws.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that Governor DeSantis's order prohibiting private businesses from imposing their own private requirements, you think that's problematic. Is that right?
No, based on what the state statutes are, it certainly could be problematic. And remember, most of our federal civil rights legislation, for example, allow, the old Ollie's barbecue case from the 1960s, requiring a Georgia barbecue restaurant to serve, Black interstate travelers. That's based on the Commerce Clause. That's based on interstate commerce, not some other principle. So what are you going to do when we have purely intrastate travel, perhaps within Florida? Is there a federal interest that could prohibit the governor or preempt the governor's action? It's really it's an open field depending on state statutory law and what they've enacted so far. And probably most of them aren't sure how broad the courts will construe their statutes and certain classifications.
I think Bill Watkins is right to point to these accommodation laws, but I would also like to ask him about just the inherent police powers. Public health has traditionally been seen as a police power of the states.
Protected by the 10th Amendment.
Right, but just going back in Anglo-American law to the earliest days, and can't the governor say, this is my construction of what the public health should require?
Depending on what the legislature or the
Has done
Constitution
about this, yeah.
mayor has delegated to him.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the states definitely have the power to govern the health, welfare, and morals of the people. And typically that type of legislation or regulation, as long as there's a rational basis for it, the courts will recognize that power. So while there's a broad open field for that, my point is just that the states have put a lot of restrictions on themselves in the public accommodation field, which is implicated here.
So
I think the three of us could agree, though, that we'd rather that they not boss private businesses and entities. It's okay if they want to say, state driver's license offices have to, do this and that. But I think if they tell Joe's Barbecue that he can't restrict who comes in, we'd rather that they not do that, even if maybe they legally could. We maybe would rather that it be a private property-based thing.
It seems to me to be a property thing. Yeah, it really. But of course, it's so confusing for people looking on, trying to interpret all of this, because on the one hand, Governor DeSantis's ruling binding private businesses looks like a blow for freedom.
Right.
So individuals can go freely in and out of private business, but then it looks like a blow against freedom because it constricts the freedom of the business owner.
And the same thing is true of the vaccine passports. You could say, well, it's a blow for freedom because the person who has the passport is suddenly free to do a bunch of stuff. Or you could say, and I think this can be true at the same time, that it sets up bad incentives. It will cause a political scramble for priorities. It will cause people who don't need to get vaccines urgently to get them and push others aside and so forth. So there's always trade-offs and there's always complications to these policy measures. So I think we want to recognize the private property owners' rights, and we also want to discourage, I believe, these vaccine passports just because they're socially have too many bad incentives.
Yeah. So, for example, what this means, just to get philosophical for a second, is that those of us who have a great esteem for individual liberty, we may not always need to ensure that state power protects individual liberty. We may actually have sometimes more need to have a social consensus favoring individual liberty, and rather than insisting upon the posture of the state in one way or another.
I think another way to look at it is watch out for a meaning of freedom that means compulsory, autonomy. In other words, instead of autonomy, it should be based on your justified rights. Your person shouldn't be attacked, your property shouldn't be stolen or infringed on. That kind of liberty is a better system for a compossible, in other words, always everybody can fit with everybody else having all the same rights. If you have it as autonomy, in other words, you can do whatever you want. You don't have the point that many justices have made about you don't have the right to swing your fist and connect with somebody else. That's not the kind of freedom we want. That's an autonomous distortion of freedom.
So Texas Governor Abbott, his executive order forbade state agencies from requiring these passports.
I think we could
I'm all for that. I'm all for that. Yeah. So while we're on COVID, there's another thing I was going to ask Bill Watkins about. The COVID crisis has, of course, produced lots of restrictions. Some of them may have been temporarily needful. I don't know, but a lot of them look pretty dubious. And apparently the U.S. Supreme Court recently agreed that California's restrictions on private worship meetings were excessive. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think you recently wrote something about that for us as well.
Sure. It was a case brought to the court seeking an injunction on California COVID measures where a pastor was prohibited from having a Bible study in his home that had more than 3 representatives of other families
Yes.
present there. The pastor argued successfully that this was a violation of the First Amendment because religious activity was not being treated as well as equally with secular activity when you have hardware stores, nail salons, massage parlors, etc., not subject to those restrictions. You could have 4, 5, 6 household representatives in these commercial establishments, and therefore that religious activity was not being treated as well. The Supreme Court agreed and therefore applied strict scrutiny. Otherwise, it's a rational basis standard, something that we talked about a little bit with the police power, but it infringes a fundamental right in this case. And the court, again, reminded government that you can have these COVID restrictions if they're reasonable, but if you're going to treat religion differently than secular activity, you have to show a compelling state interest. And again, that this is narrowly tailored to further that. And in this case, it wasn't. As the petitioners pointed out, under California law, they could have rented out their home to a movie studio, and you could have had dozens of stagehands and actors filming a movie at the house from multiple families, and that's okay, but you can't get together and pray. Again, it's a clear no-go there.
And the decision was a pretty hefty majority, was it not?
It was a 5-4 decision.
Oh, not a hefty majority.
The 3 liberals joined in a dissenting opinion, arguing that this was a rational rule of general applicability. And Justice Roberts just said he would, not have granted injunctive relief, probably due to a mootness argument insofar as the state was changing the regulations in this particular area. But the court has held with this mootness and standing issue that it's still going to hear these cases because it's too easy, for example, in the New York City case for Governor Cuomo to just change a rule and say, oh, well, the rule you're challenging is no longer in effect.
Right.
As long as they have that power to keep moving the goalposts and do it quickly, the court is not going to let that be a bar to hearing the case.
That's good. That's rather heartening. I mean, it really was troubling to imagine what the justification could be for treating different groups, some favored, some disfavored, so differently. And this characterizes so much government regulation. And of course, the trouble is, anytime you get government power deployed to restrict some activity, it's always going to end up stepping on its own toes. That's just why, how about as little government regulation as possible so that we don't have to have the government fall into these holes all the time on how to distinguish one group from another. Let's just stay out of it, Okay, so
I would encourage people who go to religious services, and I could see a slightly crowded one at the Easter service I attended, but anyway, to keep some distance and think about your singing, your
be sensible,
reciting things outside. You might want to keep some distance, and where you can't keep distance, be wearing a mask. And also some services are held outdoors. Older people might want to do it outdoors. And be sensible. That's right.
Yeah.
But the government is always going to overextend this sort of thing.
Okay, so let me go somewhere else that some of the same principles may apply here, but I'm just going to change the subject now. I was looking at some polling results regarding the way that business corporations are taking positions on big public issues. So I think we all know now that Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola and Major League Baseball have all decided that Georgia needs to be punished for having adopted new and more higher scrutiny voting requirements in their state. And so, I thought that what that would probably mean as a public reaction would mean would suggest that maybe a majority of Democrats would agree that those corporations should take a stand and maybe Republicans shouldn't. But apparently, according to this Scott Rasmussen poll that just came out last week, it's not true. He found that 59% of Americans think companies taking political positions adds to divisiveness. And over half of self-identified Democrats agreed. And then again, another poll, 66% of Americans thought corporations should not be taking political positions. And again, over half of them were Democrats. So even among self-identified Democrats and also among Republicans, Americans don't think that these big corporations should be posturing in the public square on political issues and telling us what to think. What do you guys think about all this? Were you surprised at the position taken by Delta Airlines, for example?
I think it's part, again, of this neo-racist fashion that we're going through in this country. And they're afraid that the clamor and pressure and people jumping up and down over this is going to hurt their business. But I think it's crazy because once they do this, they're on a slippery slope. They're going to end up having to take more and more political positions. Companies should only take political positions on policies, laws that directly affect their business activity. And they should, make some kind of united front to the extent they can that that's what they're going to do. Because otherwise they're going to be sucked into every kind, what's your position on abortion? What's your position on, any number of things. It's not healthy for the companies, and it is divisive. And in the case of Georgia, it's based on a lie about the law.
That's especially troubling, yeah.
That is, it's not only this bullying of these companies and the companies bullying their employees and back and forth and round. There's also just a lie about what the law is in Georgia. It's, maybe it's not exactly the law that the three of us would have picked, but it's certainly similar to has components that are similar to the laws in multiple other states, including many long, predominantly Democratic states. So I just think
requiring proof of identity primarily.
There's many states that do that.
Yeah.
There are many states that have, multiple day voting that's similar to what Georgia's proposing. Mm-hmm. It's a lie about the law.
Bill Watkins, do you know anything about the particulars of the Georgia law? I think you're next door in South Carolina. You're probably following this a little better than I have. Am I right, or are you not quite as clear as I am?
No, you're absolutely right on this. If you look and you compare certain provisions of the Georgia law to, for example, New York State's law, in many ways, the Georgia law is more liberal than established law and other jurisdictions that we would associate as blue states. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea that this is somehow a new Jim Crow, that's crazy. Doesn't even count as hyperbole. That's just foolish, and that's reckless rhetoric there. To get back to your initial point, why do you see such a cross section of people saying corporations should stay out of this? Is I think people are sick of every facet of life being politicized now.
Yes.
If you want to go to a baseball game, if you want to watch a game on TV at night when you get home from work, you want to forget about the politics. You want to forget about whatever, your workaday job. You want to zone out and enjoy entertainment. That's being taken away because we can't have a performance. We can't have a game that somehow does not make a statement about social justice these days. And I think even the lefties are getting a little tired of that.
Yeah, there may be some reaction could set into this kind of a thing because it's pervasive. I think Bill Evers was going to make a comment on the point.
I think Bill Watkins has said it well, and so have you, Graham. So I think we could go on to something. Let's not forget Afghanistan.
Yeah, let's mention that. Okay, summarize the latest. It's a new deadline, right, Bill? Right, Bill Evers?
Oh yes. So the United States had agreed in the Doha Agreement to early May as when we were going to leave, bring our troops out of Afghanistan. So President Biden announced that it's going to be September 11th. And so he's picking that date to bring the troops out. Now, there could be military contractors. So these would be like private military operators of some sort that are in there that might be paid for by the United States government, but they won't be American troops. There are a lot of contractors in there now. Now, I don't know, we're talking about, President talked about a lot of foreign aid going to Afghanistan. Usually when we have foreign aid, we have auditors. In the case of Afghanistan, we have a thing called the Special Inspector for Reconstruction in Afghanistan. I don't see how they're going to operate. I mean, it's difficult for them to operate now. I don't see how they're going to operate. Most people predict that various Islamist groups, militant jihadi groups, are going to, there's much of the country that they control now, but they will expand. And so, you know, the president essentially said, we're leaving. We've been there 20 years and we're leaving.
It's unbelievable. 20 years. How did that happen? 20 years.
It's because instead of doing the main things, which would be defeat Al-Qaeda, catch and punish Osama bin Laden, and punish the Taliban for sponsoring and allowing Al-Qaeda to operate, instead of just doing those minimum things which we accomplished a long time ago. Not, you know, a few years ago, but many years ago, the first few years, they decided they were going to do nation building and democratization and, you know, trying to make Afghanistan a lot like the United States. And that's a big, big project. And, you know, just as the Russians tried to make Afghanistan like a little mini Soviet Union, and they didn't have very much luck. And they, you know, of course, they favor a much more horrible totalitarian system. Ours is more open and would have, you know, there might have been something that would be attractive to many people in Afghanistan. But anyway, it was, you know, it was an unfertile ground for the American project. And so it's taking all this time.
Of course, many people have noted that if the U.S. pulls its influence down to below a certain level, that Taliban power will grow, and that'll have bad effects. It's almost certainly true. I mean, it'll have
almost certainly true.
Oh yeah, well, and the next part of the argument goes like this: that will lead to a diminution of women's rights and women's equality in Afghanistan. Ergo, the U.S. should leave its military forces in Afghanistan for a longer time. This is a pretty convoluted argument. There's something to it. Obviously, if the Taliban grow in power, then Afghan women will be obviously far worse off than they have been with the U.S. power in place. The question is it the role of the U.S. military to deploy its weapons on behalf of women's equality in Afghanistan?
I think if you look over the whole world, there are lots of places where women do not have the rights they have in the United States. And that would be a big project for the U.S. military.
Bill Watkins, you had a comment, I think.
No, you've got to realize that the whole, welfare and warfare states are twin heads. As you feed the military-industrial complex, as you feed the nation-building enterprise, the central government here only grows stronger, and actually our liberties are more at danger and infringed. If we're to be a shining city on the hill for Afghanistan, then we should conduct our business at home well and be an example for people that they can use their own free will or to choose to follow or not. Winning political liberty in their own home country is a matter of their own, that's their work to do. It's not our work to do. We have enough to do here to try to preserve what we have, much less bring it to the rest of the world.
I mean, if they ask my opinion, I would certainly offer it that they should construct a political and legal system in Afghanistan which vests women as full equals in their society. But they're not asking me. The issue here is U.S. weapons on the ground and troops on the ground. Kind of stunning, really. I mean, when a country like the United States, with such a massive military presence, makes a fateful decision to stay longer than necessary in a country like Afghanistan, now 20 years worth, may be necessary at the beginning, or at least may be justified at the beginning, but then, follow on 18 more years, say, and then decides to leave, it's very difficult to extricate a great power from a situation which it shouldn't have stayed in so long without it having unintended or secondary bad consequences. I feel for President Biden and the strategists in Washington on this point, because to pull U.S. power out is going to have some, there's going to be some fallout from that, and some of it's going to be bad fallout.
No, look at the South Vietnamese when we pulled out of Vietnam. Again, a place I don't think we should have ever been involved.
Right, same thing.
To begin with, but there were bad consequences for people that we looked at as friendly and looked to us for help, and that we wanted to see model democratic institutions, etc. But it was the absolute right thing to get out of Vietnam as soon as we could. We should have done it much sooner. Same thing here.
I'm not opposed to letting refugees from Afghanistan come in, and I think the British should let tons of refugees come in from Hong Kong, or the United States should let. The thing is, I want to say something else, though. This is based, I ran the schools in Iraq for about half a year.
You were part of the nation building project?
That's another long thing to talk about. But
Okay.
anyway,
Go ahead.
So I would say, we were there occupying, and we were in charge of the country, and so something was going to be done to restart the schools. So I just leave it at that. I did not try to radically transform their schools. So, and the White House did not want me to do that. They warned me beforehand. They said, "You have lots of ideas, Bill. Cool it. Just get them open." Anyway, so one of the things that happens in the Arab and Middle Eastern countries, and Afghanistan is not Arab, but it's part of this larger Muslim influence area, and it's a tribal, area, a lot of traditionalist values, is they look at American TV and movies, and they see women. So it's one thing to say, women should have rights to start a business. Women should be able to go out of the house without being accompanied by a male relative everywhere.
Educated, elected to office.
Right. Okay. So this is some sort of stuff. But they look at the people in these movies and on television, and they see the outfits that women are wearing, and they see the sexual mores of the women and so forth.
Women and men.
And men, obviously. But the point is, they think if they allow women to vote, women to start businesses, women to be able to travel, it will mean that suddenly everybody will have these sexual mores, these habits of dress and so forth that they find not good. And so what I told the people that I talked to about this is, that's not really true. You can have traditionalist mores at the same time. It's not some kind of inevitable slippery slope that people will have. You can have conservative sexual mores and a free society. It's not, look at the three of us. This is more or less what we favor, and so I don't think it's something that can't be done. And we have states in the United States that are not all like California and New York. They are, people probably dress more modestly and behave more modestly, and they're still free. And there might be a bohemian subculture or something in those states, or those cities and
I'm
localities.
thinking of Utah maybe as an example of what your
Yeah,
point.
I that would be an example, but it could be other places too. And so it's not something that they couldn't have a freer society politically, economically, culturally, socially, without still preserving certain things that they think are integral to living a good and decent life. And so, but this is a big thing. I mean, I think Dinesh D'Souza has written a whole book on this, but I think he goes way too far. But I think there's a kernel of a point here that this is a worry of people in these countries.
No, if those of us in the United States who are advocates for a high level of protection for individual freedom, if we also, by which I mean, protected from government keeping its hands off her, if those of us who favor that kind of individual liberty here, we're also making it clear that we favor the kind of healthy and moral, social, non-governmental practices and institutions, it would be a much more attractive package. But people looking from a distance, it's really hard to see. They fear that the American solution is one whole package, and it's individual liberty, and it's freedom for pot, and freedom for drugs, and freedom for sex, and freedom valued, and all those things.
They think it's either going to be Jane Fonda as Barbarella or Jane Fonda as very strong feminist. It doesn't have to be that.
It doesn't have to be that way.
It could be other things.
Right. I mean, I think it's a very salutary effort actually to think carefully and precisely about the ways in which government's hands should be tied and the ways in which society should be full of healthy collaboration, that we should influence one another, seek to
society,
the whole society, non-governmentally, but socially, having a healthy way of life that sustains human beings is super important. As important as keeping the government out of our pockets and out of keeping them from restraining our hands. Government is the problem, but the solution is more than just getting rid of government. So maybe we should draw this to a close in a minute. I think that you guys might have had a couple more things you were interested in commenting on. If so, I don't want to cut you short. Bill Evers, did you have something else you wanted to add?
I would throw in the interesting thing that we have a lawsuit in California against the school district in San Diego, the public schools in San Diego. And it's been launched by a group called Californians for Equal Rights. And it's saying, stop foisting this neo-racist ideology on the school children, on the teachers. You're a public institution. You shouldn't be fostering racial discriminatory things on school children or on teachers. And we'll see where the suit goes, but I think it's probably a good thing that this is something that's being tried.
This is fascinating. I'm looking at the piece here that you gave me earlier today. It's not only Californians for Equal Rights Foundation, but also the San Diego Asian Americans for Equality and the U.S. Asian Art and Culture Association, among others, and they're all objecting to these mandatory training programs in the school district that are all about racial equity, which is code for adopting the conceptual apparatus of critical race theory, which poses certain groups as villains and certain groups as oppressed heroes. And they're pointing out that there's a highly charged racial discrimination motif is being foisted by government power in the name of equity and equality. It's a very complex situation. And their lawsuit strikes me as having considerable merit. It also reminds me that in the last couple of years of the Trump administration, President Trump issued a ban on the use of these kind of diversity training or equity training, so-called equity training workshops in federal office settings.
He was very right to do so, but he got nothing but grief for it.
Yeah, and
including from candidate Biden.
Right, and President Biden now has rescinded the restriction which President Trump had put on these race-based sensitivity programs. Do you think that this suit, either of you, and maybe Bill Watkins as an attorney can comment, do you think that this suit, which argues that the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and the California Constitution are all being violated by these racial sensitivity mandatory training sessions. Do you think that there might be some bite in that lawsuit, Bill Watkins?
We would hope to make progress any way we can, but we also have to remember that local school districts should be left to implement their own policies as they see fit, to have autonomy that reflects the values of the community. The bigger problem is not a legal problem, but this wave that is rolling over the country where educated people otherwise with good sense, are buying into this anti-racism narrative that the United States was founded on evil principles, that there's a system of institutional racism in place, that so long as there's a disparity in outcome, that is prima facie evidence of racial policies implemented to try to hinder minorities, etc. We have to just overcome that, and it's not going to be in the courts. We have to get our heads and hearts around this idea that, again, as a Christian, I would say that we're all made in the image of God. If you're not a Christian, then you can certainly believe that we have certain natural rights.
All individuals are equal as individuals.
No, that's right. And we just have to get past this ugly part of our culture right now that is making everything a racial issue. Every time a cop has an interaction with a minority, the media runs to put that on the television as if there's some nationwide problem when, for example, the most recent shooting in Minneapolis, nobody wants to talk about had the kid who had a warrant for criminal activity not fought with the police, not tried to get in his car and speed away, there would have been no emergency situation where officers would have deployed any force. But again, no one talks about the poor decision of that individual. It's some sort of assumed racism rather than a tragic accident is what it was.
I think that the injustice and tragedy of long-standing racism in America is not going to be overcome by the imposition of a new form of racism that continues to stigmatize people and identify them by their racial identity rather than as persons or as individuals or as citizens. I think some people think that that's a solution to the old racism is the new racism. I say that no racism is the solution to racism.
I think I wonder if we have time to just briefly mention the co-founder of Black Lives Matter and the multi-million-dollar housing that she's buying in white neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. A $1.4 million home. I mean, think of the decorating expenses.
Anyway, luckily life has its humorous side.
Right. Maybe some of these things can sort of poke people to pay attention and say, it's not, these things aren't all what they're cracked up to be. Let's be a little more common sense-ish. Okay, so with that, I think I should just express my gratitude to William Watkins for joining us. Thank you so much, Bill Watkins.
Good to see you, Graham.
It's always a pleasure to have you, especially when you're wearing a bow tie. And also, let me give my thanks to Williamson Evers. Bill Evers, thank you for your insights as always. And we do invite our friends far and near who are joining us on ThinkSpot and through other platforms. Please turn to the Independent Institute. We are accumulating resources that you can use on our website, independent.org, that can help you navigate some of these things. I mean, we don't have all the answers to everything, but we've thought through some of the stuff and done some pretty serious research. So go to independent.org. And also join us about 2 weeks from now for the next episode of the Independent Outlook. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care.